Dawn breaks on August 31st, 1854, along London's broad street. A local mother steps outside to fetch her daily pitcher from the neighborhood pump. The liquid appears crystal clear and fresh. She returns home to prepare a morning meal, unaware that by sunset, 2 of her kids will perish. Within days, she too will pass away, utterly clueless about her murderer. Just last evening, a dozen souls on this very block lost their lives. They weren't claimed by conflict or famine, but by an unseen horror. The neighborhood appears normal, and residents continue drinking from the flowing spout. This scentless, invisible predator lingers among them, silently picking its next targets. Within 10 days, 500 locals will be wiped out here. Their ultimate salvation won't come from physicians or breakthrough medicine, but from a simple drawing. Let's pause and look at the broader picture of this era.
It is mid-1854, and the British capital sits at the pinnacle of its global dominance. Its vast empire spans a full quarter of the planet. Railways link distant towns, while telegraph wires bridge entire continents. Just 3 years prior, millions flocked to Hyde Park to celebrate human innovation. Surrounded by steam machinery and towering glass, the nation proudly declared, "We have finally mastered the mechanics of modern society." Roughly 2.5 million citizens reside in this bustling metropolis. It boasts the largest urban population globally, brimming with immense civic pride. But step away from the gleaming exhibition tents and the bright avenues of Mayfair. Follow me eastward, deep into the cramped quarters of Soho. The pathways shrink and the sunlight vanishes. A wretched stench assaults your nose, a mix of burning coal, animal waste, and a deeply sickening rot. These narrow alleyways remain largely unchanged since the Middle Ages. Originally designed for just 50,000 residents, they are now suffocating under 500,000. Gaze upward at the towering structures, where each protruding floor blocks out the sky. Sunlight pierces these gloomy corridors for merely a couple of hours daily. Now glance at the ground, where an uncovered trench of filth flows right down the cobblestone center, while massive families cram into single sweltering bedrooms. These residents aren't idle or neglectful. They endure exhausting 16-hour shifts in local factories and bustling markets. They return to these bleak conditions simply because this is the only existence available to them in 1854 London. For their daily drinking water, they rely heavily on the Broad Street corner pump, actively avoiding the notoriously foul River Thames. The river's stench was actually so overwhelming that lawmakers recently draped chemical-soaked linens over Parliament windows just to tolerate their chambers.
While locals know the river is essentially toxic, the pump yields water that feels crisp, transparent, and reassuringly pure. For decades, entire families and young children have been raised drinking from this very well, without anyone ever linking it to sickness. Yet, during the sweltering summer of 1854, a silent, unidentified menace began accumulating in the reservoir right beneath their oblivious feet. The most progressive metropolis in the world remained blissfully ignorant of the impending disaster, entirely unprepared for the sheer devastation ahead. The horror begins on the evening of Monday, August 28th, when an unnamed infant girl living at 40 Broad Street falls severely ill. After washing her sick baby, the mother dumps the contaminated water into a neighborhood cesspit located a mere 3 feet from the trusted pump. That little girl, whose name history tragically forgot, perishes 2 days later, becoming the first casualty of an imminent nightmare. By Thursday, August 31st, 12 locals have perished, prompting anxious whispers and quickly bolted doors across the increasingly tense neighborhood. Initially, there is no sheer terror. Residents simply try to convince themselves that sudden fatalities are just a normal part of city living. However, by Friday, September 1st, the death toll violently spikes to 70, and a deeply infectious, irrational panic takes absolute hold. This invisible terror sweeps through the cramped alleys faster than rumors, forcing desperate families to hurriedly pack up whatever they can carry. One property owner on Berwick Street hurriedly boards up 3 of his buildings, fleeing the area with no intention of returning. Nearby, a torn mother ships her kids off to relatives in Lambeth, paralyzed by indecision over whether she should join them. Down on Broad Street, the usual vibrant hustle of morning vendors and rattling carts completely vanishes, replaced by a suffocating, unnatural quiet. It isn't absolute silence, but rather a muted, cautious atmosphere, almost as if the entire neighborhood is terrified to breathe. By Saturday, September 2nd, the grim toll reaches 127 fatalities within a mere 72 hours, all from this single avenue. These aren't just statistics, they are real families, including the veteran local cobbler and an uncountable number of innocent children. This ruthless speed is exactly why the disease is so unprecedented, striking a community at full strength rather than building up gradually. The brutal symptoms strike without any forewarning, starting with a heavy ache in the gut, before escalating into violently agonizing spasms. Next comes a catastrophic depletion of bodily fluids that leaves unaccustomed physicians utterly astounded by the sheer volume drained so rapidly. As the affliction enters its terminal phase, the victim's face physically caves in, leaving sunken eyes and a haunting blue-gray complexion. Medical professionals of the era termed this the algid stage, as the dying shivered with icy cold, despite the sweltering August heat. A seemingly healthy man might stroll to the market at dawn, be bedridden by midday, and have his funeral arranged by midnight. Tragically, the grieving relatives who desperately nursed that dying man likely drank from the very same local water source that morning. When Sunday arrives, the district is largely deserted, leaving behind only the destitute, the elderly, and those too ill to escape. Yet, right on the corner, the Broad Street pump remains fully operational and entirely unguarded, dispensing its icy water to anyone still thirsty. The deadly illness shows no bias, and the local water source continues to flow freely, completely ignored by officials. Residents keep drinking from it, simply because the greatest metropolis of the era is utterly clueless about the true nature of this plague. The leading scientific minds of the 19th century were grasping at straws, relying on a flawed framework to explain the mounting death toll. It is crucial to realize these physicians were not foolish or lazy. They were highly trained experts armed with a confident yet completely incorrect diagnosis. They firmly believed in a concept known as miasma, an ancient term describing polluted toxic air rising from decaying garbage. According to this prevailing dogma, noxious vapors crept along the cobblestones and infected anyone unlucky enough to inhale the foul stench. The tragic irony is that this explanation seemed incredibly logical to anyone walking through the squalid streets of the neighborhood. Destitute slums reeked of filth and suffered horrific casualties, while affluent, pleasant-smelling districts remained largely untouched by the tragedy. This undeniable link convinced everyone, including pioneering health reformer Edwin Chadwick, that foul odors were the direct cause of the epidemic. Chadwick successfully campaigned to flush raw sewage out of the capital, drastically improving sanitation based on a completely misguided premise. Consequently, as the nightmare unfolded, authorities strictly followed the miasma rulebook by clearing garbage, burning fragrant plants, and ventilating sick rooms. While every single one of these official countermeasures seemed perfectly rational to the experts, They were all fundamentally useless. Even more terrifyingly, letting crisp drafts into homes caused severely dehydrated victims to lose body heat much faster, accelerating their demise. Relocating sufferers to upper floors only increased physical contact, inadvertently spreading the contagion to more caretakers in the process. The pleasant scent of burning herbs merely provided a deadly illusion of safety, blinding these brilliant minds to the actual culprit lurking in their water. This dangerous illusion of proactive treatment blinded the medical establishment, ensuring the true, invisible culprit remained completely undetected. Meanwhile, the terrified residents of Broad Street were trapped in a nightmare, surrounded by a soaring death toll they simply couldn't comprehend. They obediently carried out the useless instructions handed down by England's most prestigious physicians, desperate for any shred of salvation. Yet every single morning, these same families casually strolled to the local corner pump to fetch their daily supply of water. They did this blindly because not a single figure of authority possessed the foresight to warn them against drinking from it. The terrifying answer to their suffering was sitting mere feet away from them, completely unseen and entirely unsuspected by the masses. But as September dawned, a man named John Snow grabbed his coat and notebook, driven by years of deep suspicion. He marched directly into the heart of the Broad Street neighborhood, determined to start knocking on doors and demanding answers. Instead of asking residents about the smell of the air, he posed a radical question. Where do you get your drinking water? This 41-year-old physician ran a local surgery in Soho, just a quick 5-minute walk from the epicenter of the tragedy. While not a household name, he held significant professional respect, having famously administered chloroform to Queen Victoria during childbirth. More importantly, Snow was a man of meticulous observation, having spent years filling countless notebooks with exhaustive data on cholera. Following the devastating 1848 epidemic that claimed 50,000 British lives, he began using hard evidence to systematically dismantle the miasma theory. He relentlessly tracked neighborhood outbreaks, carefully cross-referencing the geography of the disease with the layout of the city's water supply. His maps proved that laborers enduring the most nauseating stenches imaginable frequently outlived neighbors in cleaner streets, directly contradicting the bad air theory. He noted that upper-floor residents often survived outbreaks that decimated the levels below them, simply because they relied on distinct water supplies. This stark reality of shared air, but different water, led Snow to publish a paper in 1849, arguing that contaminated water spread the disease. The medical elite politely reviewed his findings, but promptly shelved them, unable to accept such a radical and disruptive conclusion. If Snow's waterborne theory proved accurate, it meant the entire Victorian framework of sanitary reforms and ventilation campaigns was utterly useless. Consequently, when the terrifying September 1854 outbreak began, authorities ignored him, leaving him entirely out of the official public health response. Instead, he sat alone in his Frith Street office, reviewing the mounting casualties from Broad Street with a hardened, growing resolve. Driven by 5 years of ignored warnings, he finally grabbed his coat and notebook, heading directly into the epicenter of the crisis. He lacked any institutional mandate or formal backing, venturing into the stricken neighborhood purely driven by his own unshakable medical convictions. Moving methodically from house to house, he knocked on every door, politely requesting a moment to speak with the terrified families. More humma, he posed identical questions to both survivors and the newly bereaved. Who perished, and exactly which water pump did they use? More humma, residents answered in various states of shock. Some were desperate for help, while others spoke purely on instinct through their fresh grief. More humma, documenting every single response, he retreated to his study each night to plot the tragedies onto a meticulously hand-drawn map of Soho. More humma, rather than drawing simple dots,
He sketched stacked lines for every lost soul, building grim columns of mortality above the affected addresses. Mohammed, the initial scatter of marks seemed chaotic, but by the third day, a chillingly precise pattern finally revealed itself on the paper. Mohammed, defying the prevailing beliefs about wind or toxic sewer vapors, the tragic lines of death were all converging tightly around one singular spot.
The undeniable epicenter was the iron water pump at Broad and Cambridge. A seemingly safe fixture the neighborhood had blindly relied upon for generations. Staring intently at the paper, the physician finally held the concrete proof needed to validate a grim theory he had harbored for half a decade. Like any meticulous investigator, he scrutinized the anomalies, focusing on a nearby workhouse that suffered remarkably few casualties despite housing dozens of inmates. His inquiries revealed that this specific institution possessed its own private well, meaning its vulnerable residents rarely touched the contaminated street supply. Similarly, a local brewery situated right in the infection zone reported absolutely no fatalities among its workforce, prompting another urgent investigation. These laborers survived the horrific outbreak simply because they drank employer-provided beer and drew their water from a completely different, deeper source. Closing his notes, the doctor realized these stark anomalies perfectly validated his terrifying hypothesis, rather than dismantling it. Armed with undeniable evidence, he now faced the daunting task of convincing stubborn officials whose very careers depended on his waterborne theory being entirely wrong. Stepping out onto Broad Street that morning revealed a haunting stillness. A local bakery stood deserted, fresh loaves left untouched on the counter. Inside a nearby schoolhouse, rows of seats sat vacant before a blackboard where an unfinished math problem remained perfectly preserved in chalk. Out on the cobblestones, an abandoned coal cart sat without its horse, while a solitary child's shoe rested tragically on the silent pavement. This quiet desolation painted the true picture of an epidemic, sharply contrasting with the bustling, oblivious crowds just 2 streets away on Oxford Street. Unaware of the impending doom, desperate residents continued to queue at the fatal well, including an elderly man, a young girl, and a mother cradling an infant. Because medical experts still blame the foul air, these victims trusted the crystal-clear water, completely oblivious as a tiny hand reached for the iron lever. As that deadly water flowed, Snow threw on his coat, steeling himself to confront the 12 formidable members of the Board of Guardians that Thursday evening. Thursday night, September 7th, John presented his grim findings to a dozen stoic men on the Board of Guardians. He mapped out the local tragedies, proving the affected workhouse and sickened brewery workers all traced back to that singular Broad Street source. Met with heavy skepticism, 2 grueling hours of debate passed before they finally agreed to detach the pump's lever, purely out of sheer desperation. The following morning, without any fanfare or gathering crowds, a lone mechanic unbolted the lever and quietly carried it off. The horrific epidemic immediately vanished, yet the stubborn committee replaced the mechanism shortly after, leaving Snow completely uncelebrated before his sudden, fatal stroke at 45. He collapsed over an incomplete manuscript, passing away without a single accolade, even though history would eventually prove his revolutionary theory absolutely correct. It took the unbearable great stink during the exact summer of his death to finally force Parliament to build London's massive, enduring underground sewer network. But his ultimate triumph was pioneering germ theory, destroying the myth of toxic air, and ushering in a brand new era of sterilized medicine. Because doctors finally began washing their hands and tools, human life expectancy essentially doubled, jumping from a mere 40 years to over 80. His groundbreaking method of tracking sickness is still studied in modern universities, even serving as the blueprint for mapping our recent global pandemics. Today, You can stroll down Broadwick Street to find a reproduction water pump, a commemorative blue plaque, and a pub honoring his memory. Every single time you effortlessly twist open a faucet and safely drink, you are experiencing the profound, invisible world this lone physician engineered. That monument remains just steps from the original contaminated well, an unassuming tribute to a discovery that fundamentally altered human existence. If you ever visit, grasp that iron handle. Remember the tragic victims of 1854, and then step inside to enjoy a completely worry-free drink. Drop a comment below telling me which historical location we should explore next, and I will catch you in the upcoming era.